Mike Glover is a former Special Forces operator, Green Beret, and a former CIA contractor as well. He is the founder of Fieldcraft Survival, which just recently launched a very robust platform application covering all things survival and preparedness. I highly recommend you guys go check that out. And he's also the author of the very important book, Prepared. Again, highly recommend you check it out. Given Mike's background, he has a very intimate understanding of this particular subject, and I very much enjoyed our conversation. I hope that you do too. So without further ado, yeah. Mike Glover.
Hey, what's going on, man?
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on and doing this and talking about what seems to be kind of an unorthodox subject. A couple of days ago or a week or so ago, you reached out after my father passed. You know, that was a very powerful experience for me and sent me down quite a rabbit hole, I would say. Just thinking about a lot of things and it opened up a lot of doors in my mind, and I wanted to talk about it more, and I wanted to seek out some individuals who I thought would have a very powerful voice on it. I think the reason I sought you out, number one, my dad was a veteran as well. He instilled a big appreciation in me for veterans and the people that serve. So he would definitely be a big fan of yours. Secondly is you're a veteran. So you've been up close and personal with this subject. And I think thirdly, you are, to me, the gold standard in the preparedness space. And what could be more important to prepare for than the inevitable that we're all facing, right? I think I would just like to ask you, firstly, is what was your first experience coming across death? Was it somebody you knew? Was it a stranger? What was your first encounter?
Yeah, my first encounter with death, it was my grandmother's brother. He passed away when I was a child in my grandma's home when I was in the same house. And
Right.
I remember being a young child. I don't even remember how old I was. He actually, I found out later, he passed away of AIDS. He had,
Oh, really?
he was HIV positive and he had AIDS. Back then, this is in the 80s, there was no treatment for it. And he lived with my grandmother, her brother, and she caretook him, and he was seemingly fine. He didn't look ill. Yeah, he would sit up and he would watch TV, and you could tell he wasn't right. And I remember being very young, seeing him. I didn't make the connection like this gentleman's passing away. This could be the end of life for him. And
Right.
so I woke up one morning and there was commotion in the house, and my aunt discovered him, and he passed away on the couch, like nearly sitting up, just slumped over. And I remember all the commotion and all the emotions and just not understanding it. But that was like, oh, he just passed away. And then I went to his funeral. So he was alive one day. I'm interacting with him. He passes away. I'm in the house with him and see everything that's going on. And then we're putting him in the ground the following couple days. And I'm like, man, this is just something that's very different. But that was my first interaction with death.
How old were you, Mike?
Man, I must have been 7, 8. I was younger than 10, and I had started living with my grandma on and off when I was 6 or 7. So somewhere between 7 and 8.
Right. And do you remember what the people around you were saying about what just happened? I mean, were they giving you information on it? Were they telling you what had happened and explaining it to you?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, and I don't think I've ever told this story in any format, but my grandma's brother, this gentleman, and I apologize, I don't know his name. I wasn't
Yeah.
very close to him. He lived in pretty rural Georgia, where the rest of my family was from. He was gay,
Yeah.
and he had a husband or a boyfriend, and I remember not as a young person, not like you never went, oh, this is different. I was just like, oh, I'm like, who is that guy? He's my uncle. Like, people tell him to call him my uncle, and I think you would call him as your great uncle. And he went to the funeral, and he was there, and we'd had all these interactions. And I remember him showing me, my grandmother's brother's stuff and his house, and and the place where he was. And I found it all very interesting because it was all flashes of moments. But if you ask me to bring up any memories from that experience between 6, 7, and 8, I couldn't tell you anything. But I could tell you that I was at his funeral. I remember how much people cared about him and loved him, and the expressions of their stories of him, and this very intimate setting. I even have memories of the room and the casket, and people crying, but also people laughing, and how it didn't feel like home, because I remember we traveled to this location in Georgia, and I even remember going into his room and his lover showing me like stuff that was his and talking about him. So it's really crazy because it's these weird connections of memories that were very likely tethered in my psyche, because it had to do with something that was traumatic, something that was different. And I think it was the beginning of me realizing what death was, which was all these things, these emotions and all these feelings that were conjured up.
Right. It's so fascinating. And now you have kids. Witnessing that, is there something that you would tell your kids maybe different than that?
Yeah, I think I would be more honest and very clear. I'd likely get on my knees and get eye to eye with my children and take a moment to pause to communicate to them what this whole thing was, because they up to now, except for, I mean, yesterday, it's funny, I picked up my kid. I picked up my daughter. I have twins, a boy and a girl. I picked up my daughter, and she wanted to touch the mule deer that I harvested 2 years ago,
Right.
which he ate. I mean, the first morsel of meat from that animal was me taking it off the skillet and giving it to her, and she lit up and she was like, "Ooh, that's yummy." And I told her back then that was from an animal that Daddy killed, but we respect animals that we kill. And when I picked her up, I reminded her, because she wanted to pet it. I said, "Say thank you." And she said, huh, "Say thank you for what?" She goes, "You ate this animal, and we respect life because it gave us its life so we could eat." And she said, "Oh," and she petted it. And then my son, after I put her down, wanted to get up and pet him and say, "Thank you, thank you." And so they're already making the connection. But I think that's important. I think an older
So
generation, how we grew up very analog, often not because of neglect, just because it's not on their mind, don't make that connection that these children are being exposed to this type of thing and have no context. And so I think it's important to develop the context for that. And I certainly would have the conversation with my children.
100%, and I think that's a great way to establish some sort of ritual around death that makes them understand it better. I guess let's move a little bit. Is there any other experiences that you had before you got into the military with anybody else dying?
Well, what's interesting is, before I went in special forces, when I was in the Army, but very young, 18, 19, one of the first jobs I ever had part time, I had two part time jobs. One, which people were like, "You had a part time job in the military?" At that time, at that unit, pre 9/11, we had nothing but time. I was a mechanic at Honda for a period of time, and I also worked at a funeral home. And
What?
I worked at a funeral home called Joseph Gawler's Funeral Home in Washington, D.C., which is very well known as being the funeral home to the presidents. They did JFK, they did Jacqueline Kennedy, Thurgood Marshall, Vince Lombardi, very famous people of the day. At a very young age, 18, 19 years old, part of my job was I was an assistant funeral director. So I'd help with embalming, I would help with dressing and doing all the things with bodies. But I also picked up deceased people from hospice, nursing homes, and even their homes after they passed away.
Wow.
And so very early, I started being exposed to a connection with death in a very intimate way. I'll just share one story with you related to two different instances. I started to develop this opinion that everything you do in life is living for a moment where, if given the opportunity, you make a transition from life to death. And if you haven't lived a good life, you transition horribly. If you have, you transfer and transition peacefully. because I had two separate instances where I picked up both of them older women, one in her apartment, like condominium thing, surrounded by her family, and one in a hospice surrounded by her children, her two sons. The lady that I picked up in the condominium, she had grandchildren that were in the room with her. When I arrived, her son answered the door, who was an older gentleman, likely in his 40s or 50s, and the all I remember is screaming from the children. And I went and I said, hey, where is she at? He showed me where she was at, and she was in a column pillared bed, and it had four pillars, and it was like the scariest bed I've ever seen. It was like, and it was like big like lumber, and it was cut oak, and it was like real scary, and it had like a creepy veil over surrounding it, and that was for her to sleep inside this little thing. And when I got to her, she was sitting up, and her mouth was open, her eyes were open, and her like she was in this terrible posture where likely she was dying and in pain, and she died frozen in that moment. And I like looked at the guy, and I looked at her, and then I looked at the children that were his kids, which was her grandchildren, and they were screaming, and I was like, I wanted to scream. And I'm like, can you get your children out of here, because they don't need to see this. And so I pulled her down, and I tried to close her eyes, which that's only in Hollywood. You can't really do that,
Yeah.
depending on the onset of Rick or Morgus. I closed her mouth and was like, oh my gosh, like she had a horrible transition.
Wow.
Take that in contrast. I picked up a lady from this hospice I'll never forget. I went to this room. It was a very dark room, and her two sons were there, and they were very calm, and they were very peaceful, and their mom looked like she was sleeping.
Yeah.
And tethered to another memory similar to that, I picked up a lady, and she looked like she was sleeping very peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. This one lady had pictures all over her ceiling and every square inch of her room, that her family had taken every memory of picture, cut it, and plastered the entire room with memories.
Wow.
And she was surrounded by love, by memories, by visual representations of those memories, and it was super powerful. And I made the distinct understanding that there were two ways to do this, and if you didn't live your right life, or the best life that you could with right intentions, you could have a horrible transition. And so that was my context for going into the global war on terror, and fighting and seeing a lot of death after that.
Wow. Fortunately, that was my experience. My dad passed away in hospice with our whole family there. And we were just crying, laughing, telling jokes over his dying body the whole time. And it was just a wonderful experience, a very connective experience. And I felt very fortunate to have that experience. But then I think about the people that don't get to have that experience. And maybe somebody's life is taken, or somebody's loved one is taken from them. It's a very wide spectrum of what that looks like. But take us into the military, man. Take it, because this is a whole nother level. How did that all kick off for you, and what was your first experience in that world?
Yeah, prior to the global war on terror, I anticipated proactively that I wanted to fight, and I wanted war. I wanted conflict. I remember I wrote a poem. I used to write poetry when I was young, and when I was in the military, that was a good creative outlet. And I wrote a poem about war and conflict. I posted it early on like military.com, which is like an old school forum for military members. And a lot of people were like, what are you doing? Like this, like you shouldn't want war. And I thought, as a young man, these guys are cowards. These aren't courageous people. But some of those people that said that were Vietnam veterans. You know, I held that in reserve, I think, from my experience. And I just, it wasn't top of mind, but it was in my head. And then I went to war and took lives, and certainly lost friends. And after that whole experience, like coming home, man, I realized that I wanted conflict. I wanted to fight, but the act of taking lives, albeit I don't regret, because of the circumstances that I was put in, that the guys I was with was put in. I don't regret those experiences because it could have been potentially our lives. But I'm not so lustful about the idea of taking human life, because it is a very serious thing. And I think there's something I learned about that, and educate people now, that, man, yeah, you want to fight because testosterone, and because maybe the evolution of survival in your species, or in human beings, period. But I started to realize how fragile life could be,
Yeah.
but also how beautiful life could be. I mean, certainly I have imprints of memories of losing friends, some guys dying in my arms, and I never have been like, man, that was so tragic, and it destroyed me, because I do try to see, as a realist, as a naturalist, the beauty in life lived to its fullest potential, and the fact that people, although physically not here anymore, live on through memories, live on through conversation, live on through spiritual context. And so, man, it was a radical experience that feels more like a mushroom trip than anything else.
I bet.
But certainly something I never regret, and something that I'm very thankful for.
What's the mindset? Because I would imagine that you can't really be questioning yourself too much out there, but yet I guess compartmentalizing that, and being able to sort of like leave that at the job and then come home and be a well-adjusted father or a husband. How do you do that?
You do it really just the best way you can. I mean, a lot of people don't do that well. I certainly have been guilty of that, but I think
Sure.
I had a lot of a multitude of experiences as a young person that made me prepared and more resilient. One of the ways that I dealt with it often is communicated about it, and not harbored it. Where other guys, because they can't make sense of it, they make their own assumptions, and often that assumption is wrong. I also think, spiritually, and maybe for a lot of people religiously, that experience helps make sense of the crazy world around us. But I also just default to nature, and what nature is, and how brutal and real and beautiful nature is. So for me, I had a culture of men that I grew up very close to me, because even in the same organizations, other people had different mindsets. Like, if we lost a guy on target, like we lost a guy, and he was a friend, he was a comrade, and he was killed, we didn't lull for any reason. We got up the next, or even we the same moment, got up and continued to fight and continued to go out in operations. And I remember when one of our guys tongued the win, a Vietnamese descended sniper. I mean, he was one of the best snipers in Third Special Forces Group. Everybody knew he was like one of the best shooters in Special Operations Command. He was killed on target, and they wanted to shut us all down. And so the mindset of the other teams were, we need to mourn. The mindset of my team was, and I was not in a position of power or influence or control, was, we don't mourn, we get vengeance. We don't lull, we fight. And so I was fortunate to be on that side of the experience, where I didn't have time, because the focus was doing the job. And then when I defaulted to, hey, is it my time to mourn? I didn't need to mourn, because I understood, like, the circumstance. I mean, one of my best buddies, Ben, who my son is named after, I wasn't downrange with him because he was leading a team. I was at home, got the word that he was killed, and had to receive his body. I mean, I had to. I was there when they unzipped him from the body bag,
Wow.
back home, because his wife wanted to make sure that it was him, and she wanted me and another buddy, Eli, to go over there to the funeral home, receive him, and make sure it was him. And so we had to look at our best buddy sitting on a slab of table, and looking at him, nearly not recognizing him because he stepped on a pressure plate IED, an improvised explosive. I realized, staring at a piece of flesh, a piece of body, that he died in that moment doing what he loved.
Yeah.
And many people don't get that experience. So I've had many experiences like that to bring in full circle my understanding of what death is. It sucks. I mean, I had a buddy kill himself 6 months ago, and I was there through the entire process. It sucks, but I think I'm just more prepared to deal with the circumstances because of my perspective, mostly from when I was young.
When you kind of are just in the thick of it, and like you said, you're just going to push on and do your job, and you kind of kick that trauma can down the road for a lot of people, it just, I'm sure it just catches up with them at some point. How have you continued to just sort of, you're like one of the most well-adjusted guys I know, and I know a lot of military guys. It's hard, man, for a lot of people. So I'm just curious what your mindset is, having all these sort of things that are just stored up there in your mind. How do you continue to just kind of deal with it?
Yeah, I teach it in self defense. It's we often when we think about justified actions or justified
Mm,
scenarios or situations we face, we think about it from a moral and ethical and even legal justification. And a lot of the things that I experience in death, I think, are a part of life. You know, from harvesting animals and seeing them take their last breath to killing people and seeing them take their last breath in war. I just know, like, I'm very primal, and I know a lot of the things that I've witnessed and experienced are part of the nature of human beings. And so for me, morally, I have no issues with I have no conflicts with my actions nor the circumstances that people were put in. And at the end of the day, life sucks a lot of the time, and we want absolute and utter control of all the things around us. And so my mindset is you don't always have control. And when you want it the most, you might have it the least. So that perspective for me is kind of like giving up the relinquishment of control, and not on the woo woo side, because I'm very analytical about it, but saying, hey, man, what by design is going to happen is bound to happen. Yes, you have control of your role and position in it, but not always. So I've accepted those terms. Most of the people around me who have passed away, I could have done nothing to affect the outcome. And so what I can affect is my outcome, my children's outcome, by educating them and preparing them. But even then, I mean, I tell people all the time, like, you could train and make this a lifestyle and slip, fall out of your shower, and hit your head on the toilet and die naked, alone in your bathroom. And how ironic is that? So my perspective is what I do have control over is my actions every single day. What I do have control over is living a fulfilled life. And so I will do that until the very last breath. And if
yeah.
given the opportunity to reflect on a life, I hope to reflect on no regrets and go, yeah, man, this was worth the ride. I'm exactly where I need to be, and peace out.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my mindset in it. But I think the reality for me is overall, as a society in Western culture, we don't understand or we don't know how to get it right. And
Yeah.
a lot of that has to do with how we want to present ourselves or present the situation that is death to the world around us. And I think it's a poor way to do it. The fact that we want to manage emotion. I mean, do people know why they wear all black? They wear veils. Do people know why they put their loved one full of embalming fluid in a mahogany casket that costs $20,000 into a concrete bin into the ground? I
I mean,
like
now you're getting into the industry of death, which I think is like a $20 billion industry a
It's
year.
massive. You know, I worked for the funeral home and saw all the ins and out of the business side, and I was disgusted by it because we often get it wrong. And then we think other cultures that have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years through their own traditions, we think it's crazy to burn a naked body and send it out to sea. You know, I think it's crazy that you would want to be embalmed and preserved like you're alive when you're dead. The whole viewing process where you have people, you know, usher by in troves, looking at their deceased loved one in a really grotesque form that's inanimate, that doesn't even look like their loved one in real life, is just
Yeah.
it's backwards. So I think from the onset, we just have a backwards way of dealing with death, and the military profoundly has a SOP, a standard operating procedure, and they often get it wrong. I think where you see the right is the connections with team guys or military members who are friends or comrades of those lost, and how they communicate and support the family. I think that's the connection that's right.
100%. I think we're getting it very wrong. I just saw you post up a GoFundMe for a friend today, and I know he didn't pass away, but I see probably 10 GoFundMes a week for trying to help people to just cover burial costs. I mean, I don't understand why something that is so central and core to living, how we get it so wrong. How do you think we can fix it? How can we help people cultivate a better relationship? I think when we bring death to the forefront of our minds, we're not going to be wasting as much time, right? We're not going to be staying in relationships that we hate longer than usual. We're not going to be staying in jobs that we hate longer than usual. There's just so many peripheral sort of effects. How do you think we should go about maybe fixing that?
Yeah, I saw it on the military side. I saw it in the funeral home side. I see it in first responders, especially firefighters who see kind of the worst side of trauma to people, including children. The best way to do it is talk about it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
communicate about it. I noticed right out the gate as an 18, 19-year-old working at the funeral home, the disconnect with people and the fear of people to confront death. Like most of the people that I, walked through their home where their loved one was, were in absolute denial that their loved one could have died or was going to die. They didn't want to see me. And I must have, at a very young age of 18, 19 years old, looked like death
Yeah.
walking in with a
The,
sickle
the
and
Grim Reaper himself.
the Grim Reaper himself in a black cloak coming to snatch their poor loved one away. And I had a lot, like I remember I was in a hospice, and it was assisted living. It was like a nursing home. I walked in, and one of the ladies was in the same room in a bed next to her friend who passed away, and they kept her in there. She saw me and hid behind her sheets like a little child. And
Oh my
I remember thinking, well, one, the innocence of her and how she was defaulting to like being a child, but two, likely how I scared her because she thought I was death knocking on her door and she
God.
would be next, being rolled out in the velvet body bag. And so I think part of the significant issue we have overall is we don't talk about these things, which I think why this is so important what you're doing right now. But I also think a lot of the burdens we share, we don't do that as a culture. We don't share our burdens. We hold on to our burdens. And always use the analogy of like Native American tribes sharing the burden by pouring their burdens or their glass of burdens into other people's cups. That is something we haven't done. So our cup tends to overflow. Native Americans had very specific and special ways to deal with death. I think those elements, albeit so basic, are the start point and like having the conversation with with people we love. And who I see the most resilient are solid Christians. Solid Christians, or solid people of faith, solid Muslims, solid Hindus, solid Christians. They deal with death really well. I mean, Cameron Haynes, who's a renowned hunter I spent some time with, was talking about his buddy Roy. And his buddy
Mm.
Roy fell off a mountain. He fell 800 feet to his death doing a sheep hunt, or I think it was a goat hunt. He fell to his death. The most resilient person in that entire circle of everybody who was closely connected was his spouse, his wife, because he said his wife had looked out and she could see the peak of the mountain where he had passed away. The night that he passed away, when she got word, she opened the blinds, looked out at the peak, and she saw a flash of light come off the peak. And she
Wow.
knew right then, in an overwhelming sense, that God was taking care of her loved one. When we have outside entities or spiritual connections, it doesn't have to be God. It could be spiritual, it could be whatever. I think that helps us make sense of the world around us. And I think that's a positive thing. The more we can lean on things like that, the better balance will be in our psyche.
Just tapping in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Well, it's a deep subject. I'm sure we can unpack it in a million different ways, but I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to leave you with one more question. How would you want your death to be dealt with? And what would you want the experience to be for your loved ones who are left behind?
I had the same feeling when I was in the military. I even had it written down on paper because you take a death photo pre-deployment as part of the pre-deployment process. And
Wow.
I did that over 9 times to war. You fill out your will, you fill out a questionnaire of things that you would want to be done when you die. And we used to joke about it all the time, even making funny faces during our death photos. But I always said, one, I don't want to be touched. Like, I don't want to be washed. I don't want to be filled with embalming fluid. I want to be immediately cremated, and I want my ashes to be brought to my loved ones, and I want all the money that would be spent on a funeral to be spent on celebrating my life and building more memories, so the ones that I love can go into their life, back into their life, reinvigorated with energy versus mourning and all the things that is typically done. I want afterlife for them to invest in the memories and then talk about me over the dinner table, and laugh like you did with your father, because
Yeah,
I think that's the way we become closer connected with death, but also the people that we lose in our lives.
I love that. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you, man. This is an important message, and thanks for having me on, man.
I think so. Let's keep it going. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.